Greetings, everybody. Thank you for joining for the finishing the last time that we'll look at chapter 13 of Phaladipika, which is the chapter on longevity. So here's a summary of all the things. It's pretty useful, actually. It's a pretty useful summary. So let's do it. The chapter opened up by explaining the necessity of being able to estimate longevity. Because a lot of people think, why would you even touch that topic? So his point is it's necessary to estimate the lifespan before you read a chart, especially for a newborn. Because if we don't know how long someone will live, we don't know which of the results indicated in the chart can reach maturity. So how do you read a chart if you don't know how long the person is going to live? If the person is supposed to live for 20 years and you're sitting there spending time thinking about things that take 50, 60 years. So he said it's very important, especially for the very first reading in the beginning of the person's life. It's very important to estimate the lifespan. But making a truly conclusive decision about the lifespan, however, requires extremely careful attention to many principles correlated by several predictive tools like chart evaluation, transits, dashas, etc. So that's what he said in the 25th text. So this is really a summary of the first statement that he made and the last statement that he makes in the chapter. First statement he makes in the chapter is, hey, before you interpret this person's chart, why don't you figure out how long they're going to live? Before you start making interpretations about their career, their marriage, and everything. And the last thing that he says is, before you say how long this person's going to live, I hope you know your shit. I hope you know your astrology, because if you don't, you better just don't even touch the topic. So the upshot of it is, therefore, one should not entrust this task to any but the most confidently trusted astrologer, which is what he said back in the first text. So this is why the most important reading that you do in a traditional culture, like the Vedas, when someone is born, if they're going to have astrology done at all, just like you look for a good hospital to have a birth, you look for a good doctor, a good midwife, whatever, you look for the best astrologer. For that first reading. Because they have to do the most difficult work. Nobody knows anything about this creature yet. And they have to figure out things like lifespan, which are very difficult. Okay, so you understand that's the background. The background on the lifespan evaluation is that it's necessary to do it, especially if it's not already obvious that the person has lived a certain amount of time. If you have a person coming to you for a reading who's 60 years old, there's zero necessity to do the lifespan reading. Right? Even if they're like 30 years old, even like if they're in their 20s already, it's already like, well, you're going to live long enough to have a career, get married. But if it's as it was in traditional society where newborns were getting their charts read immediately, then you need to do lifespan calculation, but you shouldn't have your uncle do it just because your uncle is into astrology, or your aunt or your grandma. You should get the most expert person, because there's a lot of factors to correlate. Any questions? If you have any questions, go ahead and ask them. Meanwhile, we'll continue. So now he gets into the topic of lifespan. He says, first of all, everybody basically agrees humans can live about 100 years. So divide this into 6 segments, and then we can have similar terms for what we're talking about in terms of lifespan, right? So when you say if somebody lived a full life, in Montreuil's terminology, that means they lived 100 years or more. Okay? Yes, it is, Christy. Long life is almost a full life. So full life means, you lived the maximum amount or more. Long life is between 70 and 99. That's basically what people kind of expect, right? Or hope for. Medium is between 33 and 69. And short is from 20 to 32. And then less than 20 is called tragic, and less than 8 is called childhood. So those are the lifespan types that he those are his lifespan types. Those are his lifespan categories. When he says long life, he means 70 to 99 years. So he's just clarifying that first. If you have questions about what we're talking about. First, attempt to classify the lifespan within one of these 6 categories by examining a chart to see how indicators of short or long lifespans accumulate. So this is what you do. This is how you do it. How do you figure out the lifespan? This is how you do it. You attempt to classify the lifespan within one of those 6 categories. First, you make sure you check to see, is it going to be childhood death? Is it going to be a tragic death? Is it going to be a short life, medium life, long life, full life? And the way that you do that is you examine the chart to see how the indicators of the short or long lifespans accumulate. I'm actually tired of repeating the same thing over and over again. If you guys want to learn astrology, you have to watch the videos that are already recorded. So, because I already taught you all this, how to do this. And it's just lazy if you make me repeat it over and over again. So it's not like there's one indication somewhere that's going to mean that you live 93 years old. But if you have a different thing, then it means that you live 32 years old. It's cumulative processing. And you have to know how to quantify and accumulate your observations. If that doesn't make sense to you, then you can't do it. But, I mean, the people figuring out the soft hair surfaces of black holes, it also doesn't make sense to me, and I can't do it. But I still appreciate it and sort of know what it is. So, even if you cannot do this, you could probably at least pay enough attention to be able to appreciate how it's done. So the more indicators of short life, the more powerful or perfectly they are found, the shorter the lifespan likely is. I hope that you listen to that. The more indicators of short life, the more of them you see, the shorter the life is. And the more powerfully you see them, the more exactly you see them. And vice versa, the more you find the indicators of long life, then the longer the life. Okay, so now let us talk about the negative lifespan indicators. So these are the things that will indicate short life. The more of these that are there, the shorter the lifespan is, and the more dramatically they're there. So number 1, there's no auspicious influence on the ascendant, first lord, or moon. And that's from the text, the 8th text. So if you want to look that up in more detail, you go back to the recording where we discuss the 8th text. There are no auspicious influences on the ascendant. Well, what if you have some slight aspect from Jupiter to the ascendant? Then you don't have this too much, do you? You have to learn how to think in quantity. Quantity of the condition, not just binary on or off. If you have no auspicious influence on the ascendant, but quite a bit of auspicious influence on the first lord, then you quantify that. So the most negative situation would be you literally have no auspicious influence on the ascendant, first lord, or moon. And that means you don't have Jupiter, you don't have Venus, you don't have Mercury, you don't have a 9th lord, you don't have a 5th lord, you don't have a first lord influencing those planets. Okay, that's the first thing. And the thing that's crushing about this particular one is this doesn't necessarily do anything bad in and of itself. But this means that you have no protection. If there's no auspicious influence on the ascendant, first lord, or moon, that means there's no protection. That means anything else in the chart that comes negative will have a full effect. Will have no mitigation. The second negative lifespan indicator was from the 12th text. There are inauspicious planets in 1 and 8, or 1 and 7, or 7 and 8. So inauspicious generally means malefic. Maybe it also means like an 8th lord, 12th lord. If you have them in these paired up, like there's a malefic in 1 and 7, then that's a short life. 1 and 8, or 7 and 8. The ascendant and moon are between malefics. The moon is weak in a dustana. What does it mean that the moon is weak? Maybe it has low bala. Maybe it also has low dignity. Maybe it is not full at all. The moon is waning, number 5, with a malefic and in a trine, or the 7th. The moon is in Mrityu Bhaga, in a Kendra, or the 8th. So these numbers here are the numbers of the texts. And if you're sincerely interested in it, you just go back and you rewatch those videos where we covered these texts. 7, the ascendant is influenced strongly by a malefic. This is a real one, strong one. So this is kind of like the opposite of the first indicator. The first indicator was just like there's nothing to help. This one is there's really bad effects. So if the ascendant is A, B, C. A, influenced strongly by a malefic. B, at a sign border. And C, that sign border is Gandanta. Gandanta is the border between water and fire. Then this is really short life, if all three of those are met. Eight, if the first and moon's lord are in a Rashi, if the first lord and the moon's lord in the Rashi, Drakan, and the Vamsha are weak and in a Dushtana. So it's cumulatively worse. What do we mean here? Watch the 13th text explanation to remember it. It means if the first lord and the moon's lord are weak and in Dustanas in the Rashi, it shortens life. Also, Drakan, it makes the life much shorter. And also in the Navamsha, they're weak and in a Dustan, it makes the life particularly child death. 9th principle, first lord and benefics in Apaklama, while the 8th lord and malefics are in Kendra. If the 8th lord and the malefics are in the Kendra, then the 8th lord and the malefics are dominant. Shortens the life. The 10th principle that he covered in this chapter was if the 8th lord is stronger than the first lord. And the 11th principle that if the 8th lord is stronger than the first lord, shortens the life. If there's enmity between the first and the eighth lords, shortens the life. If the first lord and the moon's lord are both in fixed signs, or one is cardinal while the other is dual, shortens the life. Okay? Those are the shortening indicators. The more you find the shortening indicators, the more profoundly you find any one of them. You pile that up, you figure out how to quantify it, how to judge it, how to weigh it. The more weight there is to these things that reduce lifespan, the shorter the lifespan gets reduced. On the other hand, there's the positive indicators that will lengthen the lifespan. And here they are. In the 22nd text, he said, a strong Jupiter that aspects the ascendant is extremely positive. This weighs a lot. This can counterbalance a lot of negativity. A strong Jupiter aspecting the ascendant. What if you have a strong Venus aspecting the ascendant? Give it some weight. Figure out how to weigh it, because Jupiter obviously is good because it's a benefic, right? And so is Venus. What if it's the ninth lord? Same thing. Think. Angles and trines without malefics and with the first lord in Jupiter is also very positive. This will really extend the lifespan. The angles and the trines do not have malefic planets, but they do have Jupiter and the first lord. Okay? That counterweights a lot of negativity. So in other words, that increases the lifespan very significantly. The third thing is good conditions affecting the first lord, moon's lord, and moon. So that's the opposite of the first principle, right? If you have good conditions affecting the first lord, moon's lord, and moon, then that counterweights negative conditions. So that will also extend the life. The moon is in a Kendra in good dignity, especially in Cancer, Pisces, Leo, or Sagittarius from the 23rd text. So this will extend the life. If the moon is in a Kendra in a good dignity, the moon is a healthy planet. But especially if it's in Cancer, Pisces, Leo, or Sagittarius. Now this principle, some of these are opposites from the shortening principles. If the eighth lord is stronger than the first, and malefics are in the Kendra. So this is a loophole to this 10th shortening principle, which is if the eighth lord is stronger than the first, then you get shortening lifespan. But there's one loophole on that. If the eighth lord is stronger than the first and malefics are in the Kendra, 8th and 12th, then that lengthens the lifespan. So in other words, if the chart is being run by malefic planets and the eighth lord is very strong, then that's a long lifespan. But otherwise, the eighth lord being stronger than the first is not good. If there's friendship between the first and eighth lords, that lengthens the lifespan. If the first lord and the benefics are in Kendra, while the eighth lord and malefics are in Apoklama, that lengthens the lifespan. So a lot of these are just opposites. 5, 6, 7, 8. These are just opposites from these, remember? If the first lord and benefics are in Apoklama, while the eighth lord and malefics are in Kendra, shortens the lifespan. Vice versa. First lord and benefics in Kendra, while eighth lord and malefics in Apoklama, lengthens the lifespan. The 10th principle of shortening was eighth lord is stronger than the first. So then the opposite is first lord is stronger than the eighth. But also if eighth lord is stronger than the first in a malefic run chart, then it also lengthens. The 11th principle of shortening was enmity between first and eighth lords. So the opposite principle is friendship between first and eighth lords. And then if the first lord and moon's lord are both in fixed signs, it makes the life short. If the first lord and moon's lord are both in cardinal signs, it makes the life long. And then, or if one of them is cardinal while the other is dual, it makes the life short. But if one is fixed while the other is dual, it makes the life long. Okay, that is a summary of the all of the techniques that he gave in this chapter. Now he says now he talks about how to corroborate it. He says, well, I say it's probably sufficient to know the general lifespan range. It's probably sufficient to just know they have a full life or they have a long life, somewhere between 70 and 90, right? That's sufficient to do the rest of your predictions. But if you want more detail, or if you're being very careful, because sometimes one of these careful considerations will make it impossible for the lifespan to be in that range. So if for some reason you want to go into more detail than just those lists, then there are other techniques to bring to bear, which he mentions in this chapter. He says you should also utilize Vimshottari. And what he said about that was in the 18th text. He says, within the range determined by the above principles, death is most likely in a dasha of accommodations of planets that are inimical in the chart and to each other. So what he said was, once you tally up these conditions and you get an idea, like, I think this person is going to, it looks like this person should live to be about 80. Then you look at the Vimshottari of their life at about the age of 80. Is there any combination of dashas and subdashas around that window that look very bad? If not, then it's not going to happen. They're not going to die during that window. It could even push it to be sooner, or it could push it to be later. If there was a very weak Vimshottari dasha that came sooner, then the death could happen sooner than you otherwise expected. Or if there's not a weak Vimshottari combo earlier in the person's life, but there is one immediately after that window where you expected, then it would be there. That was one. Another thing he says is you should combine this with Saturn transits. He said Saturn's transit to the death point within the lifespan range indicated by the above principles is very likely time of death. The death point is an amalgam of the degrees of Saturn, Jupiter, Sun, and Moon. We covered that one. We actually covered it wrong. I calculated the death point incorrectly. I just neglected to subtract 1 from every sign. But anyway, you calculate the death point by summing up the degrees of Saturn, Jupiter, Sun, and Moon. And then when Saturn transits that death point, it's a likely time for death if it's within the window of where you expect their lifespan to be. So that's another thing that he said you can do. He says one more thing in the 19th text. He said, even the first Lord transits can also be important if the first Lord is the one that's the weak point. If the first Lord is weak, combusted with a malefic, then its transits can indicate the time of death. It should transit the first or any Dustan from the D1, D9, D3, and Moon cumulatively. All right. Let me explain them because it's a beautiful technique that if you pay attention to, you can see how the gears of astrology work for people that are really adept in it. He says, first of all, he says, if you see a particular planet in the chart is really indicative of this person's death, then the transits of that planet are very important. So, for example, if it's the first Lord representing the body, that you think, man, this first Lord is so frail because it's combust and it's with a malefic, for example, then watch the transits of the first Lord, because that when that frailness gets fructified, that's when the body breaks. So if you see it in a Dustana, 6, 8, or 12, or in the first house, then it's becoming prominent by its transit. But this concept here that's really interesting is the cumulative transit in amshas. Here you can see some really interesting mechanics of how really great astrologers were using astrology. So what he's saying is, when the transit comes to the first house, let's say, if that first house is the 12th house of the moon, or the 6th house of the moon, or the 8th house of the moon, or the first house of the moon, then it's much more significant, because it's in the first from the ascendant and the Dusthana from the moon. And if it's in the first of the Navamsha, or Dusthana in the Navamsha. So there's two ways to think of how they may have done this. One would be to say, well, my Navamsha ascendant is Leo. So if this bad planet is transiting Leo, then it would be transiting my Navamsha Leo. But the other, that's probably not it, in my opinion. They probably are looking at that Navamsha of the transiting planet. And when the Navamsha of the transiting planet is one of the Dust, is in, how is the Navamsha of the transiting planet affecting your Navamsha and the D3? When you cumulatively get them all to be in the Dusthanas, that's when you get the effect. It's like listening to people explain, black holes and things. It's not like any of us understand what they're talking about, but we understand that they're talking about it, and we understand that they understand, and so that gives us a path. At least we know what grown-ups do. Then he says, with other techniques, those who know how to utilize other techniques should use them too, to find likely times of death within a general range. Okay? That's the summary of chapter 13. I always call it 14. Summary of chapter 13. If I have to summarize it, it's very simple. Length of life is an important thing to know, because you have to scope all the rest of your predictions within that. And the way that you figure out is you look for the indicators that shorten life, and you tally them up, and you look for the indicators that lengthen life, and you tally them up, and you quantify all that numerically, and you get a tally of how long you think the person's going to live. And if you want to be even more careful, you kind of cross-verify the viability of that tally. This technique, this tally of these principles, gave me a guess that the person lives 83 years old. And now let's cross-verify it with a Saturn transit, or a transit of a weak planet, or a transit, or a dasha or something. And if you see that it's verified, like there's also a weakness at that 82-year-old window with this second and third technique, then you have what's called sunishchitvacha, when your prediction is so confident. And if you don't, then your prediction is not so confident, but you kind of know the basic window. Okay? Let me see if you have a single relevant question. How do you calculate dasha? Just the way that it says to do it. There's nothing complicated about it, but the only interesting thing is that we mostly assume that it's only done from the moon, but it can be done from the ascendant as well, and it seems to work better when you calculate it from the ascendant. Have you made a prediction using these techniques? Yes. That's it, huh? Anything else? Kirtan planet. Let's take a look at Kirtan planet. Looks like a nice channel. Anything else? No, but nothing else? Okay. See you guys later. There's nothing special about based on Lagna. You just use the degree of the Lagna instead of the moon. Thanks, Heidi.